So this is the Treasury of British Comics at the Metaverse, and our panel today is all about girls' comics and the girls' comics revolution, not just the British girls' comics from the 1970s and 80s, but the present and the future of comics, and how by looking back at the storytelling of these titles and the way they were put together and the things that they said actually paves a path forward for comics into the future. And I'm joined by an excellent panel of 5 guests, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. My name is Mike Molcher, and I'm the PR bod for the Treasury of British Comics, but also a podcaster and a journalist in my own right. I'm going to start off with Rosie. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Rosie Knight. I'm a writer. I write comics. I write about comics. And Mike introduced me to these amazing girls comics a few years ago, and I've just fallen totally in love. So I'm super stoked to be here. Thank you for having me.
Not at all, not at all. Joelle, you next.
Hi, I'm Joelle Monique. I'm a podcast producer and writer and critic and other things, comic book lover. And I was been really excited as the revolution of girls comics has hit over the last decade here in the United States. So I'm excited to talk some of our origins.
Olivia.
I'm Olivia Hicks. I'm everything under the sun, it feels like, but I'm a comics creator, a comics editor, and also did a PhD in girls comics, which hopefully I'll get given a doctorate for at some stage. So it feels like every facet of comics I've somehow got my grubby fingers on.
RAMZEE.
Hi, I'm RAMZEE. I'm an indie comics creator from South London, and I write plays as well. And yeah.
And last but certainly not least, with an excellent fan action going on, is Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire Napier. I'm a critic, freelance editor, and lifelong British girls comics enthusiast. So, you know, I don't discriminate.
I don't think I could have brought together a better group of people to talk about girls' comics and their impact and their legacy, but also, like I said, how this does pave a way forward for comics and speaks to where comics are moving in the 21st century. I'm gonna start off by talking to Claire, actually, because girls' comics comics in general in the 1970s and 80s, if you don't know anything about them, this was a whole world in of itself, wasn't it? Do you want to tell us what girls' comics were in the 70s?
Well, they were normal, in a way that comics have become not since, at least for girls, well, for everyone. Really, through the whole 20th century, comics were just there for everyone, girls, boys, and so on. The girls' comics boom. Like earlier in the century, it was more like great big books, like kind of what became annuals, but with more text stories and recipes and more live stuff. And they kind of got honed down into the weekly, what America would call newsstand, but we would call newsagent comics. Like the comics in themselves, and that there were just so many different titles from the 50s really onwards that had eras and ages similar to American publishing, and by the 70s, like in the American Bronze Age, they were similarly robust stories, I think, for robust readers. Like there was, I think, more of a teenage contingent reading it by the 70s and 80s. I mean, I guess there was just more of a teenage contingent socially. So that was by then they were being given options.
And in terms of the stuff that these comics were exploring, I mean, Rosie and I did a panel, was it last year or the year before?
At some point, one San Diego.
About the similarities between girls' comics at the time and kind of what you see in manga, this kind of incredible range of subjects and themes and ideas. And, you know, I mean, well, Rosie, do you want to just kind of
Yeah, I mean,
earlier.
I think the thing that's really interesting that Claire kind of touched on is the idea of comics being a thing for boys or for any one gender is a very new myopic idea. And actually comics used to sell millions and millions of copies all around the world, single issues from, the 50s onwards. And so for a long time, girls were seen as a viable market. In America, you had romance comics. And in England, the thing that was really radical was these comics cover all kinds of stuff. There were girls' sports stories. There were girls' horror stories. I mean, Misty was the comic that really blew my mind when I was introduced to it, because I was like, this is so cool. This is Elvira for girls. And then Tammy and Ginty were doing like crazy sci-fi stories and all kinds, and slice of life, and in a way that is only really being reaccepted into the comic book mainstream now with the YA boom and the OGM boom. So it's really interesting to kind of reconsider what the idea of a comic is. Comics aren't just superhero comics, which people say a lot, but that's always been the way. When there was so many more comics and they were seen as a market and single issues were still selling regularly from newsagents, newsstands, any shop that you went into, a pharmacy in America, there was a lot more space for different kinds of storytelling. And the thing that is really wild is 70s and 80s. I was born in 1988. By the time I was a kid and I was buying newsstand comics or newsagent comics from the shop next to my school, I could buy X-Men, I could buy all these different things, but the only British comics I could really buy was the Beano, or the Dandy. That culture within that small amount of time had already gone to the point where it was really just when we became friends and we started talking more, when Rebellion took on the British Comics Treasury, that I found suddenly this whole history of comics that would have just blown my mind and changed my life when I was a kid.
What is it about girls' comics at this time? And I'll open this to the floor. What are the kind of stories? I mean, Rosie mentioned some there, but what are the kind of stories that they're telling that made them interesting, and how were they telling them that was different to, say, what you saw in boys' comics, for example?
I think boys' comics tend to lead with action and violence, as we see across many mediums. And you look at boys' gendered or genred cartoons, and even early literature for guys tends to be like Three Musketeer style, very much group dynamics headed into battle, us versus them. What I love about most girls' comics is either starts from small friendships and or like places of loneliness or isolation, and sort of trying to either evolve relationships or evolve the self into like a better person. A lot of like girls' comics is like self-improvement. How am I going to achieve and conquer all these obstacles that are in my way, whether it's lady bullies or that mean teacher or aliens. And I think there's something really wonderful about especially even more when it comes from a female writer and a female artist team. It's some like a secret life plan for girls where you're like, this is where all the secrets have been hidden as to how to get through my day. Thank God these are here. And I find that with guys' content, which can be great on its own, is often much more about proving that masculinity, and that can be kind of exhausting to endure if that's not something that interests you.
Yeah, I can't remember I'm trying to remember the exact issue, but when we did me and Joelle and Mike we did a 2080 panel at San Diego about girls' horror comics and kind of Misty, Tammy, Ginty, and where they fitted into this world. And there was a comic that everyone on the panel, because some of the people on the panel were new, just blew them away. And it's like that all the girls, and they're at a school, and it's kind of like a Hunger Games-esque sports challenge. And I can't remember the exact story, but every single person on the panel was just like, what the heck? Like, and at first there's a girl who doesn't fit into the group, and they're kind of pitted against each other, but they realize they got to come together and so I think it's that mixture of, like, I was just looking at some Ginty covers, and they kind of have this incredible mix of, in America, girls' comics was like romance or fashion. And there is a lot of stuff there that I absolutely love. Like Jack Kirby did some of those romance comics. I think Ditko did too. There is so much cool, weird stuff. They had Black Power comics, like female comics. So there was good stuff happening. But Ginty, like, you look at a cover and it's like a fashionable lady and there's a UFO above her head. there was just more of a kind of scope, I feel like, in these specific comics about what women were interested in, or maybe just the idea that really anyone could read this comic, but it was good for a publisher to have a double market. So they'd say, this one's for boys, this one's for girls. But really, like, anyone likes a story about cool aliens. And I feel like that's something that kind of came across a bit more in those books than what we saw in the preceding, like the kind of the years that came after.
I think also, like, the boys comics, now I'm not a huge boys comics know-all, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it always seems like the boys comics of that era are much more sort of genre anthologies, whereas the girls comics, apart from like Misty and Ginty, are sort of like a thing going on, but a lot of them, like Bunty and Mandy, they don't have a genre, they're just Mandy is the genre. Like any story can fit into the anthology, and the anthologies were deliberately trying to offer a variety of different stories, science fiction and romance. And so because there's like a generic innovation, it's not like, oh, this is the romance comic, so you can only tell stories that are romance. Because there's like open season on what kind of genres you can tell, I think that really did sort of allow a lot more innovation and not sort of like wider storytelling than you would otherwise sort of see in a more narrow sort of, this is for girls aged 8 to 12, it will be in this genre. Here's your thing. Whereas the boys tend to be like, it's a war comic, it's a sports comic, it's a humor comic. But the girls didn't quite have that narrowness.
There's a Scarlett Thomas novel, I forget the name, but the protagonist is a toy designer, and her big task for ages has been trying to think of some gimmicky toy thing that will appeal to the cusp of puberty girls market, and it's impossible because girls of that age don't want to buy toys. And I think about this all the time because I think that is the age when girls buy less toys, and I think that's because the age when girls really become subconsciously conscious of being our own dolls and being perceived by society generally as a doll, like we're our own toys, so we don't need to buy a toy, we just need to buy things for ourselves, clothes, makeup, celebrity stuff. And girls comics for girls of this age group, I think, work so well because they're essentially like a source book for the game. Like, they're offering new scenarios, like, what if you were in this scenario, what if you were in this scenario, what would that be like? It's like a sort of next book one story of you. Like, the Bunty mascot is Bunty, and she's called A Girl Like You, and that's like the core, I think, of the what makes them so readable is that you are supposed to put yourself in that position. You're supposed to be like, what if I did wake up in a bubble dome in the future when all I was trying to do was find what's behind my grandpa's shed? That would be cool and exciting. But it's like, it's without, there's just a certain layer of dare that's missing. Like, it doesn't stop you, it doesn't suggest that you're doing anything especially audacious by reading this comic and having it appeal to you, like soap operas, which are for girls grown up in the traditional mold. You're sitting at home, you want to imagine yourself in a different scenario. Here's a soap opera with loads of stuff happening. That's what girls comics are. They're just, no one has to pay for the studio, so you can do more stuff.
Yeah, and I think that kind of the idea of like an in character and an accessibility and a universality, like, that is another big thing. When you look at these comics, like, they look like the girls are kids and they are you, and they are on the pre-teen age, you know, and they have a one body type. They're usually white. Like, these comics are of their time, but the difference is, it's not like reading a superhero comic from the 80s where every girl is like a busty supermodel. And there's kind of, that adds a different layer of aspiration or pressure on how you're supposed to look or how you're supposed to.
Well, and they're never the center character, and they're never
Yeah.
dealing with problems that women deal with. They're supporting a male character either as like, oh, here's my like hot friend, or here's a girl I hope to eventually bang, or like she's always like adjacent to his role in the comic, as opposed to, you know, these, which is very much you are the center and you are the driving force behind the narrative and the decision. Like, there's so much more shock and surprise in reading a girl's comic as a girl, because you're like, I generally don't know what I would do in this situation, and so I can't begin to guess what she would do in these situations because you hadn't had those narratives before. And so there was something like sort of electric about finding yourself for the first time in a comic book.
It always felt reading them that whereas boys' comics were very much, not universally, but very much about adult characters. You know, I can only off the top of my head name a few strips where the protagonist was a child or was a male preteen. Whereas rereading stuff like Misty and Ginty and Tammy and Girl and Pink and all that, it always feels like it's flipped the other way, that the vast majority are, as you say, characters who are roughly the same age as the girls who will be reading them. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, if you
I
look
think,
at the
sorry. No, I was saying, I think it links onto what Claire was saying about it being like a source book for your life kind of thing. I kind of like, doing my research, I kind of really dug this, like the strip, is it School for Eggheads, which I thought was really funny. Like it had like, it's about this girl who's a duffer, who's called Mitzi, and she gets like ranked as a genius, and she's not. And she's in this genius school, and she feels like a fake for it. And it kind of reminded me of like The Good Place, like the beginning of The Good Place, like how do I get to heaven kind of thing. But it has a lot of cool things about maybe imposter syndrome and feeling like you're not there. And she kind of figures herself out and is not a genius, but is a lot smarter than she thought she was by the end of it. And stuff like School for Snobbery as well, which is sort of like they'll have like their snob of the week, and they'll sort of like knock different sides of like bad behaviors, I guess. And I kind of dug that. Might be a bit too didactic, but I thought it's always done with humor. And, yeah.
Yeah, I think that idea as well, the idea of not having of idea of girlhood that isn't always serious or takes yourself seriously, and you have to look so beautiful and be the smartest and all those kind of pitting against each other kind of things that the patriarchy does. There's room for like to laugh at yourself or to be worried about yourself or to share that you're scared of something. Like that's like a classic childhood fear. Like you go to a place and you are the different one, whether you're not as smart as everyone else or you behave a certain way or you don't know the kind of structural rules. So it plays into a lot of really accessible stuff that a 6-year-old or a 16-year-old or like a 36-year-old can kind of read and go, oh, this is like, yeah, I understand where this is coming from. And kind of girls' humor publications, that still is a market that is not being tapped even now. You know?
Yeah, and I kind of felt like the boys' comics were like political in a sense of like an Alice Cooper song, like ghetto and like school sucks and that kind of stuff. Where I kind of felt like the girls' comics were a bit more subversive, like Ella on Easy Street, where she's got like her family have these like middle class aspirations. So the dad takes on 2 jobs and the mum goes on night school, and Ella figures out like her family's no longer a family anymore, like they're hardly around. So she sort of like scuppers their middle class dreams. And I kind of felt like it's done in a really funny way rather than in a really, I don't know, 2-dimensional way you find in boys' comics maybe.
That is something that came up in the panel we've done before about class, and which is a very British obsession, let's put it that way. And what these comics said about class and subverting class expectations and aspirations. Also, I kind of want to touch on for people who don't know much about British girls comics, what happened to them and why.
There was a really big boom. It's like every story in comics. There was like a really big boom, and then the sales kind of fell off, and then girls comics just disappeared. That's like the really myopic version. Olivia, I'm sure you did a dissertation. I'm sure you have like a much more detailed academic eye on it.
People always say that, but nah, I didn't do a useful academic PhD at all. I wasn't really looking at the market. I was looking at themes and what does it mean. But so I didn't really look at the downfall too much. I was like 2 paragraphs, like that'll cover it. But
it's really all there is that anyone knows about it anyway. It happened.
The impression I got is like low-key that I feel like it's a little bit like how Marvel sort of killed off all their girls comics at the moment, if I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah.
For a very controversial take, but they sort of purposely have scuppered their own girls comics titles. If you look to the boom we had in 2014 and then they've all sort of crashed, that doesn't just sort of happen. That's sort of a lot of editorial missteps and a lack of editorial attention. But I felt like a lot of we talked about the boys storytelling versus the girls storytelling. I don't think it's a coincidence that suddenly all the girls storytelling sort of was used to make the boys storytelling stronger, and like a lot of sort of those things were sort of used to bolster up the boys comics. And then I think it felt kind of was like decided that at some point boys were a more important audience, but also that girls were sort of moved more towards magazines. So it wasn't like there was suddenly nothing for girls. It was that they decided because magazines, Jackie was so popular, comics more and more started to look like magazines for girls to try and sort of get that audience. And photo strips, somebody thought that was a good idea, and it massively narrowed down the amount of stories you could tell. We talked about like you can have floods, you can have this, you can have that, you can have I'm in a bubble dome, help me. But once you've got it's got to be photographed, it's just like, well, who can, like, you know, we've got a couple of older geezers in the office, who can we get, and like we found a model somewhere and we'll have to shoot this in our back garden for budget, and it just really limits down the stories that you can be telling in the strip.
Yeah, there are some really great photo comics, but they're the only good photo comics are the really dishy ones, where it's just like about for slightly older girls, and it's just about relationships and bad boys, and still someone is maybe an alien, but not as much. But like you say, the girl storytelling being used to bolster boys comics is totally a huge thing. Like so many, I mean, Grant Morrison will say, I like the psychological storytelling in girls comics, and he doesn't write comics for girls, does he? But like with, as well as comics and girls being funneled into magazines, I think it was just like the nature of the market was to funnel that way, almost, because in the 70s and 80s, so many British comics were constantly just being merged and then launched solo again and then merged with someone else and merged again. Like 2000 AD had so many orphan strips platted into it. And it happened with girls comics too. Like, I mean, Tammy and Ginty was Tammy and Ginty, 2 separate magazines or comics. But with girl stuff, that I think the magazine content, like you might move a magazine and a comic together, and then you've got half comic, half magazine, and then when you blend them again and so on. But I mean, the fact that 2000 AD is kind of the only like the only one that's still going really from like the heyday, and that's because it's okay for boys to grow up into men who still read comics. Girls are not encouraged in that direction at all.
Yeah, and I think that as well, that mindset, when you talk about how boys comics girls comics used to bolster boys comics, that's the natural evolutionary career step for men who started or wrote really amazing girls comics was, well, you've done that now, you've proved yourself, so you can go on to the boys comics, which means no one's there for 20 years making this incredible ongoing strip, or you don't have a core group. And that happened with Marvel as well. Look at those comics from that really great boom, the Marvel Now boom, where they were doing more queer stuff, they were doing more kind of, and then look at a lot of the male creators who were involved in that. It was like, well, now you can write like a real superhero comic, you can write a main title book, you know. So I think that is actually a really key part of that interior kind of bigotry or lack of respect for like the idea of girls who read comics or girls comics, and girls not being allowed to grow up to women, so it's not who like comics, so it's not a long-going market. I think that is a really big thing to notice about why those comics didn't continue in the same way as boys or men's comics.
I think historically there is like a lack of care for girls' stuff. I think when you look at 60s Marvel, I'm going to go, Marvel's like, I'm out to attack Marvel today. If you look at 60s Marvel,
story of my life.
Stan Lee will be like, oh, well, we tried, but girls stopped, what happened? You're like, well, at the same time, Marvel's sort of plummeting all their sort of superheroines. They don't really have any, and they're killing off Patsy Walker, and they're killing off all the sort of Millie the Model. Archie is having the biggest sales of their lives and are dominating the sales. So it's like, that's not the truth then, is it, Stan? Like, girls are still reading these comics. You aren't interested in girls and you're not able to sell to girls. But that doesn't mean that girls aren't reading them, because they are reading Archie. So I think it's so exactly. I'm just agreeing with everything that you said, bro.
Yeah, Pat Mills said the same thing. He said like a lot of it was the staff didn't read, the writers, everybody didn't really warm to the material, or felt a bit, it might have a bit of, masco, whatever, sorry, I'm a bit, but yeah, I a lot of the creators didn't feel there was a lot of toxic masculinity involved, and they didn't feel comfortable writing girls' comics, maybe.
Well, and to pick up on Olivia's point today, I mean, if we look at what was causing the 2014 boom of like at Marvel with female comic characters, like when Stacey spun off into two completely new like hero/villain type characters, and like people could not stop talking about it for 2 years. It was like everything was Gwenpool or Spider-Gwen for the longest time, and it's sort of wild to me because at that time Image is also cranking out a bunch of like women-led, female-centered comic books that continue to do big numbers, things like Monstrous or Paper Girls, which have huge followings, people who like content that's there, that's invigorating, that crosses over into like a male demographic, and yet still it seems impossible for them to comprehend that these are things we want. And if we like look, and then like the American like excuse a lot of times, like, oh well, girls don't buy the action figures or the toys, but we know that girls buy dolls at like exceptionally high rates, so it doesn't make any sense to me in a genre that's mostly about costuming and style that we can't find a way to consistently produce products and develop content that women love and will continue to love for a long time, will take into their adulthood. It's a weird place to be as a girl who loves comics, and I'd be interested to hear some of the ladies' takes like as you're reading and defending your passion for this industry. I feel like I've had to stop explaining my love for comics to people, especially in maybe the last, because I'm definitely the fool who was like, this boom is permanent. Women are here in comics and it's going to stay that way. And like, we're all very excited about it. And so now when people are like, oh, well, don't you feel like, guys are sort of dominating? Like, yeah. But there's such a lovely group of women to support and love that it seems like, what's the point of explaining it to people anymore?
Yeah, I think it's like the curse of kind of, and it all ties in really to what we've been talking about, which is this idea of a disrespect for not only women who read comics or girls who read comics, really any marginalized gender who reads comics, anyone who's not a cis man, and also a disrespect for those marginalized genders who make comics, because the reality is like women have been making comics forever. Black women have been making comics forever. Jackie Orms, massive syndicated cartoonist in the 30s and 40s, in newspapers with Torchy Brown and other strips, and she was there. Marie Severin working at the Big Two, like making comics, Ramona Fredon painting these incredible Aquaman covers, doing Aquaman like in the 50s, in the golden age. These women have always existed within the industry, not only as readers but also as creators. But the company mindset and the social mindset means that people don't necessarily respect those women, and it's easier to write them out and say, well, that's new. Women have only just come in, which is why we can't really cultivate Miss Marvel or, whatever other characters. I mean, look, you mentioned Spider-Gwen, right? Those are huge characters, but who are trusted to take them on? Men. white men. That's who is allowed to tell these stories for teenage girls, which then, with the current conversation around how those men have treated young women, becomes a whole other thing. Are these men using these characters to access young women? Like, they're not telling stories because they feel like women are great readers. They're telling stories because they see women as targets. So it's a really messed up situation when there are so many brilliant people who love these stories, who want to tell these stories. You know, I've spoken to some incredible women who I just, especially women of color, who have said to me, you know, how do I write a comic for these companies? And I'm like, well, I definitely don't. I wouldn't at this point. Like, not that I have the option, but it's a very strange place to have come up as someone whose dream is to write the X-Men, and to now be looking at these companies like, curses, words coming out of my mouth. But like, these women who you would just think, if I was an editorial, I would give them that story in a hot minute. They've written TV, they've written incredible novels, and they can't even get a look in because Al Ewing, who I actually think is a really great writer and is one of the writers at Marvel I really love, but he's got 7 books, you know? And it's like, who is trusted to tell these stories? And then people bring their own external and internal biases, which make it harder. Like RAMZEE was saying, like, these men, even now, they can see the impact of the book. You know, someone like Pat Mills, who I think is so great. But back then it was like, well, girls comics, you know, that's not going to be the thing that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, people are looking back on and saying, this is important. So then those stories don't get cultivated. They don't get time to grow, you know. It's the Marvel thing. They cancel a series after 4 issues. But if it's a series by a dude about maybe a lesser known character and they like them, that series is still going. And you know that series is selling 4,000 copies a month or something, but it's still going. You know, like Red Hood and the Outlaws. Like, I always get a shock when I realize that was still going. I thought that had died of death years ago, but like, I woke up and somehow that was still there. And but like, you know, all these great, absolutely great female superhero characters we've lost. And like, I mean, like, I'm still mourning Patsy Walker. Gem and the Holograms was the best girls comic of the last decade, so hands down. And we've lost Gem. But I think I had a point, but I've completely forgotten it because I got upset. No, but I think that it's all connected, because like Mike wanted to talk about how these old girls comics have had an impact, and this is all part of the same ecosystem. But what we're seeing now for the first time in a long time is because of incredible sales of YA comics, which is obviously the big driving force, and middle grade and young readers. But for the first time, we're actually getting to see women, marginalized genders, people of color getting money from big publishers to write young readers' books.
I was just thinking that you're talking about how there have always been women making comics, and it's true. But British comics are hard to be sure about because they didn't include credits. But I know about enough men who made them that it seems like a lot, and definitely more than there were women. And it just occurred to me that maybe that is why girls comics are about girls and boys comics are about men, because that's who was writing everything, mostly men who can't imagine a woman as an admirable heroine for girls. They're writing a comic for girls. What do they want? They must want to read about girls, and we do. But it just seems like kind of a shame for that to be the absolute roof, because that is, if girls can't see women in comics as well as girls, then they'll know that comics aren't for women and they'll stop reading, and then the whole readership is just chopped off, and we get today where comics, the numbers aren't good for adult comics. So you did it to yourself, guys.
It's absolutely true. Like, I think this is something, that was what I was going to say, and I then forgot, and you've reminded me. Thank you, Claire. It's like, you always have this thing about, what will the Wednesday Warriors think? What will they think about this comic? And it is totally this thing that we have these guys who've grown up and they've continued to be catered for throughout their lives. So they're in their 50s, they're in their 60s and 40s, and they're still reading comics. But the same women of the same demographic have not been catered to, and we're trying to, and like, that's a whole we've lost, I'm not sure we'll get them back, but we've lost generations of women who love these comics and read these comics growing up. Like, you know, my mom read Bunty and was obsessed with it, and sort of like, I've tried to tempt her. I like leave like Kamala Khan at her door, and I can't tempt her back into comics. And it's heartbreaking, but it's like, it is like just sort of one of the tragedies of British publishing that we've just lost generations of women at this point.
But let's talk a little bit, because we're not far away from our time limit, but let's talk a little bit about that. Because I'm surrounded on this call by people who make their own comics, and you know, corporate plug, the Tammy and Ginty special is out now from all good retailers, and I just want to get your perspectives on the future, because whenever as a PR person, you know, we talk about girls comics, it's always the first reaction we get is no. These aren't just for girls, they're for everybody. Great, historically different, but great. And how we find a way to honor the legacy of these comics, and what it means for the future of comics. You've already talked about the influence of on American comics of female writers and things like that. So I wanted to get your perspectives. You know, I'm going to start off with Ram, just because they've written a strip for the Tammy and Ginty special.
I know. I was just going to say that it's like it was really weird for me, the mainstream horror stories, because I stopped reading mainstream comics in the early 2010s. As soon as I went to my first small press fair, I was gone. That's where my heart lay. And it was like, and there's so many girls making comics. That's where Sarah Grayley came from. There's Hannah Chapman with her comic book summer party group, and there's so much stories with female leads, queer leads, a lot more interesting stuff than what's happening in mainstream comics. It's where I picked up John Ellison's stuff as well. Like, let's not forget about him, and Hilda as well. And there's like so much cool stuff in the small press and in the underground that, I don't know. I mean, I really don't care about mainstream comics. I mean, it'll be good. The cool thing is that they can dive in and pick all these great people.
I think that is like the big move at the moment. I mean, and that is really the model that people are going for. Even like DC Comics recently started a young readers and young adult line, and that has been an incredible seller for them, like a bestseller kind of thing. And they're going for people who started as fan artists or independent creators. I mean, Nicole Gu, who is she's my friend, but also like a stalwart of like the LA SoCal convention scene, and her and Dave Baker have incredible indie comics that they all self-publish completely. And DC saw her at con and was like, well, we're trying to do books that look different, so do you have an interest in that? Because they're finally seeing the appeal of the young readers market. But what I would like to see that goes back to the old British comics that I think is that at the moment it's very it's amazing these books are getting made, but it's very like middle grade, young readers, young adult, this is what works. But what I like about these older comics is they were really weird, and they respected that kids liked weird stuff, and sometimes things could be really scary, and then they could be funny, or they could be about fashion and aliens. And I feel like we're yet to get back to that space in a really accessible way. There's people making it, like RAMZEE said, like really cool, weird stuff that you can find in these underground spaces. But I would love to get back to a place where kids could like go to a newsstand or a bookshop and just pick up something that just is really weird and kind of spans a little bit more of the age range, which is what I feel like British comics used to do really well.
Joelle, I want to get your perspective on this, because you know, we've talked about British comics, we've talked a bit about American comics as well. The storytelling legacy, the way of looking at character, the way they're looking at theme. Are we due another revolution? I know we've only really technically just had one. But are we due another anytime soon?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, especially I'm so excited as we talk about accessibilities and mainstream comics, what's available. I feel like while the Marvel movies haven't done a lot for women, I know that there are a lot of young girls who, like we did, are taking small characters and blowing them up in their minds, right? Like Shuri, to a lot of girls, is the hero of Black Panther. They're like, Black Panther who? I don't know him. There's a cool girl with dope outfits who can create anything she thinks of. And that has become like their central focus. And I think it's going to be really exciting to watch this next generation of people build their comics and try to dismantle the system and break in. And I don't know if mainstream comics will ever allow for that. We're still not seeing enough women in top positions in order to make that sort of essential central change happen. But I do think that indie comics has given us a world of fun places to play. I do think we tend to skew, grown women tend to write comics for other grown women in an attempt to engage our communities, knowing the lack of content we have. You get Iron Spike's entire like lineup, the stuff she's producing. It's so great and amazing to dive into her work, but it's not something you can hand off to children. And so I think that that's what I would be most eager to see be developed, is like that level of craft and talent and focus, but something that those girls can access because they've grown up in a world that is not just like comics, but superhero based and related. And I think that they have the shorthand and the language for it in a way that certainly I never felt I had, even though I was watching, you know, Batman, the animated series every morning and obsessed with Batman and loved Catwoman. I still felt like comics were not for me. And so I'm hoping that, you know, because of the internet, because of the amount of content out there available to them, that they don't have to have that battle, and maybe that puts them a little bit closer to the finish line.
Revolutions drive me crazy because I kind of feel like they usually happen when companies like bankrupt and they look at like what in film and in like comics as well, like they look at who the new creators are and they just take the risk, and nobody wants to take the risk, and it's just crazy. It's like, I know so much talented comic artists and storytellers, and it is bonkers. I remember like seeing like Sarah Gray and John Ellis and stuff back in the day, and it was not, I mean, it was still as good back then. It's just that they got the keys to do it, and I just hope that publishers are a bit more brave and have A&R type people that go down and take those risks, because we're not like, if you're in the money making business and you want to make money, these people make money for you. It's like it's crazy. Like it's like, oh, we're not like, we're gonna leave money on the table for our sexist issues. I don't know, but it's just bonkers. You're leaving money on the table. We're in capitalism here, guys.
Lumberjanes is a perfectly, like, it's what, 70 issues, 50 issues? So it's a ton of issues of, like, easily accessible girls content that goes along with, like, this generation's thinking of what is gender and what is sexuality and what is identity. It's prepackaged, ready to go. And if you can make any of the doll companies sign up, like, a thing, those girls have hella camping accessories, boots, shoes, different styles. Already, like, it's already prepackaged and ready to go. You just need to like take the next steps and do it. And it's crazy to me the number of comics we have out there, number of series ready to go that are IPs, that are prepackaged, that we know these companies love, that we know girls will buy, but just nobody wants to, as you said, RAMZEE, take the risk, and that's crazy to me.
Yeah, and
I was super pleasantly surprised when Alice Osman's Heartstopper became such a big thing in the UK. And it was published by, was it Harper? Or was it was a big publisher. And looking at it, it's not that much different to what I see in indie comics. It's good, and I'm not dissing it, but I'm just saying, like, if other companies want their own Heartstopper or they want queer love stories, they're there. Like, you just, and she's showing that she's making money out of it. Why not jump in?
Exactly.
This seems illogical.
Yeah.
It's like I'll do cons, and when I'm doing my own independent comics, all I'm doing is queer content for days. And you'll see, like, queer women will come into a con with this hunger in their eyes because there's so little even in like the thought bubble in the independent comics, there's so little, and it's a cash cow that I don't have time to drill properly, like, because I'm not that good. But like, if like, I'm like, you got to get on that queer woman band. They got money. They need the content. They will throw the money at the content. Iron Spike, has built this empire up for, and we know that we can sell queer stuff to younger people. We know that we can sell queer stuff to older people. Like, this is like 2 + 2 = tons of money, people.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to draw this to a close because we are pretty much out of time. Even if I edit
Can I just have one sentence?
Yeah.
I think that it's not just that they have to be brave enough to spend money on creators, but they have to be brave enough to spend money on advertising and normalization and making comics look attractive to girls and women, because the readership is there. Like, if you go to a really pretty pirate manga site, you will see comments and comments and comments and comments and comments from mums and grandmas and people just treating the soap opera like a soap opera, because it is. They're reading it. They just needed to know that it was there and then be able to get a lot of it. If people don't know that people still make comics, which a lot of people don't, how are they going to look at them?
Yeah,
absolutely, and it's just to round off. I think what's really striking about this conversation is how revolution is almost not the right word for this. This has been done before, and it was successful, and it can be successful again. It is not an aberration. There is a market there waiting to hear from this stuff. And as you know, myself and Olivia, who work for a company that publishes collections of the old stuff, you know, they can show a way forward. They can show that this stuff is possible. We are completely out of time. I mean, I could keep chatting about this stuff with you all for much longer than this, but thank you to Olivia, Rosie, Joelle, RAMZEE, and Claire. This has been an absolute pleasure, and all the very best. Take care.